They laughed at America. To them, the United States was a land of spoiled people, a place where soldiers could not fight without coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as weak, soft men fueled by luxury instead of discipline. Around smoky campfires and in frozen trenches, German soldiers turned this into a running joke. How will they survive a war without steak and candy bars? But laughter is often a mask. What those men did not admit was the fear behind the joke. Because if an enemy could be both well-fed and well-armed, then maybe he wasn't weak at all. Maybe he was unstoppable. And then, capture came. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were marched into barbed wire cages, put on ships, and carried across the Atlantic. They braced for cruelty, for starvation, for humiliation. Rumors swirled in the dark holds of troopships that America would starve them into submission, or worse. Yet what awaited them was not hunger. It was a revelation, one that began with the simplest of things. A meal. What happens when propaganda collides with reality? How do mocking laughs turn into stunned silence at a wooden table in a POW camp? And what does it say about a nation when it can feed its enemies better than they had fed themselves in war? This is not just a story about food. It's a story about power, perception, and the quiet confidence of a country strong enough to win with both strength and mercy. So let's step inside the mess halls of America's prisoner of war camps and discover how the taste of bread, meat, and coffee could shatter an empire's illusion. 1. Propaganda and the mockery of abundance. In Nazi Germany, food was never just food. It was turned into a story, a weapon of words, as much as rations. The regime's Ministry of Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, painted a very clear picture. America was soft, its people were spoiled. Its soldiers could not fight without luxuries. Radio broadcasts declared that American GIs survived on Coca-Cola, chewing gum, and canned fruit. Newspapers joked that US troops were more likely to carry chocolate bars than rifles. On the front lines, those words filtered down into trench humor. Around smoky campfires, German soldiers mocked their enemy as men who needed steak and sweets to make it through a day of war. The contrast became a point of pride. German soldiers prided themselves on black bread, thin cabbage soup, and watered-down beer. To them, suffering was proof of strength. Hardship forged endurance. And so, if the Americans needed butter and coffee, it meant they were weak. Photographs of smiling GIs with cigarettes in hand only seemed to confirm the story. The laughter grew louder. But propaganda often hides an uncomfortable truth. It's easier to laugh at abundance than to admit what it really represents. Because behind every chocolate bar, every can of fruit, and every hot meal was something frightening to the German soldier. An economy powerful enough to feed its people in war and still send luxuries across the ocean. Here lies the first lesson. Propaganda isn't always about your enemy, it's about yourself. The German army mocked American abundance, not because it was laughable, but because it was enviable. Mockery was easier than admitting fear, and soon that mockery would be tested. Because when surrender came, and German soldiers were stripped of their weapons and marched toward captivity, the question was no longer rhetorical. They would finally discover whether America's abundance was weakness or something far more powerful. 2. Fear of capture and rumors on the front. When surrender finally came, the bravado began to crack. In North Africa, in Italy, and later across France, tens of thousands of German soldiers laid down their arms. They were stripped of rifles and marched into barbed wire cages under Allied guard. And as the reality of captivity sank in, so did the uncertainty. What would happen next? Rumors filled the silence. Some swore that in America, prisoners would be starved to skin and bone. Others whispered of brutal forced labor in mines until men collapsed underground. A darker rumor suggested quiet executions, far from Europe, where no one would ever know. The fear wasn't unfounded. They had seen what the war could do. Those captured by the Soviets often vanished into labor camps, their fates unknown. Many never returned. So when German soldiers thought of crossing the ocean into the hands of another enemy, the imagination grew wild. And yet, pride lingered. On the long voyage across the Atlantic, prisoners hid their fear behind bitter jokes. Let's see how these spoiled Americans feed us. Some sneered, loud enough for guards to hear. Laughter echoed in the cramped holds of troopships, but it was thinner now, stretched over a foundation of unease. Every clang of a pot from the ship's galley, every faint smell of food drifting through the steel walls reminded them of what lay ahead. They braced for cruelty. They braced for hunger. They braced for humiliation. Here is the lesson. Fear feeds on silence. In the absence of truth, rumors grow loud. And for these men, propaganda had painted such a distorted picture of America that even the unknown became terrifying. But all of that fear would be put to the test the moment the ships reached shore. Because what awaited them in America was not cruelty, but a sight that would shatter everything they thought they knew. 3. Crossing the Atlantic. Expectations versus reality. The journey across the ocean felt endless. The troopships groaned against the waves, carrying thousands of captured men packed into dark, narrow holds. They had left behind the battlefields of Africa, Italy, and France, left behind their weapons, their pride, and the last traces of certainty. Ahead was the unknown, America. What they expected was a land of chaos. Propaganda had told them that the United States was divided, disorganized, full of factories that built luxuries instead of weapons. They imagined a poor, clumsy enemy that would surely stumble in caring for so many captives. But when the ships finally pulled into American harbors, the first glimpses through portholes silenced those expectations. Towering cranes loomed above the docks. Endless rows of trucks and freight cars rattled on steel tracks. Factories stretched farther than the eye could see, smokestacks pumping into the sky with tireless rhythm. To men who had marched through bombed-out German cities, this sight was staggering. There were no starving crowds, no crumbling ruins. Instead, America looked alive, buzzing with energy, overflowing with order. As the prisoners were marched off ships and onto waiting trains, the surprises kept coming. The trains themselves were longer than most had ever seen in Europe, cars stretching far into the distance. Through barred windows they watched as farmland rolled by green, fertile, and neatly kept. Towns passed in orderly grids, highways filled with cars, factories pulsing with production. The silence inside the train cars grew heavier with every mile. Some whispered in disbelief. Others stared and said nothing, unwilling to admit what their eyes told them. For the first time, they began to realize that America was not weakness. It was something else entirely, something their propaganda had never prepared them for. Here lies the lesson. The truth often reveals itself in simple observation. Sometimes, just looking out of a window is enough to undo years of lies. And yet, even as their vision of America began to shift, there was one final test that mattered most. Not the factories, not the highways, not the fertile land, but the food that would soon be placed in front of them. 4. The first meal. Silence in the mess hall. For weeks the prisoners had whispered and joked about what they would be fed. Thin soup, perhaps. Stale bread, maybe. A scrap of meat, if they were lucky. After all, wasn't that what America would do to its enemies? When they marched through the gates of the POW camps lined with barbed wire, watchtowers, and guards, they braced for the moment of humiliation. The mess hall doors opened, and the smell of cooking drifted out. It was not the sour odor of cabbage water or boiled turnips. It was richer, fuller, almost overwhelming. Inside, long wooden tables stretched in neat rows, and from the kitchens came plates piled higher than they thought possible. Bread, soft and fresh, meat with vegetables, sometimes even potatoes with gravy, and on some days, steaming mugs of coffee, real coffee, not the bitter barley substitute they had grown used to in Germany. The first meal silenced them. Forks clinked, spoons scraped, but few words were spoken. Men who had marched through war, hungry and hollow-cheeked, now stared at plates that looked like feasts. Some muttered bitter jokes that they were eating better in captivity than their families back home. Others didn't speak at all, afraid that if they did, the moment might vanish. For many, the shock was more than physical. It was psychological. This was not the cruelty they had braced for. It was not weakness either. It was abundance so steady and confident that it could even be shared with enemies. Here lies the lesson. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun, but generosity. Abundance can silence pride more deeply than punishment ever could. But what stunned the prisoners most was not the first meal. It was what came after. Because as the days passed, they would realize this was not an exception, not a show of mercy for newcomers. This abundance was routine, and that routine would change everything. 5. Daily rations and the power of routine. The first meal was shocking. But what truly unsettled the prisoners was what came next, the routine. Day after day, the food kept coming. Breakfast meant bread with butter or jam, sometimes eggs or oatmeal, and on good mornings, even bacon. Midday brought stews thick with beans, peas, or lentils, often with chunks of meat. Dinner might be roast beef, pork chops, or chicken with potatoes, gravy, and vegetables. On Sundays or holidays, there were desserts, pies, puddings, or canned fruit that tasted almost unreal. And above all, there was coffee. For Germans who had lived for years on substitutes made of barley or acorns, the smell of real coffee in the mess hall was almost more powerful than the sight of guards with rifles. It was daily proof that they were not in a land of shortages, but in a land of plenty. The change in their bodies told the story. Men who had marched into captivity thin and sunken began to gain weight. Hollow cheeks filled out. Uniforms loosened around growing frames. American medical officers observed the irony with dry humor. German soldiers were healthier in captivity than they had been while fighting for the Reich. The numbers tell the truth. By 1944, German civilians survived on roughly 1,500 calories a day, barely enough to endure. American POW rations, by contrast, often reached 3,000 calories, not lavish dining, but steady, nourishing abundance. Here lies the lesson. Strength is not measured only in weapons or victories. It is measured in the ability to sustain, to provide, to feed millions, even enemies, without strain. America's abundance was not a one-time gesture. It was a system, a machine of logistics that never faltered. But abundance did more than fill stomachs. It stirred questions that would echo through the barracks, whispered at night between men who once mocked America's weakness. And those questions would begin to divide them. 6. Reactions behind barbed wire. At first, the laughter continued, thin, uneasy laughter in the barracks at night. Some prisoners joked that the Americans were trying to fatten them up like pigs before slaughter. Others whispered that it was a trick, a psychological ploy to soften their will. But with every passing day, the routine never changed. The plates stayed full, the coffee stayed hot, and slowly, the jokes began to fade. Letters from home told a harsher story. Wives wrote of waiting in ration lines for hours, only to come home with turnips and little else. Children went months without meat. Coffee was a memory, stretched with barley or acorns. Inside the camps, those same men sat down to meals that seemed endless. Some felt guilt. Others felt shame. A few stopped writing about the food altogether, afraid that honesty would wound the families they loved. Arguments broke out. Hardcore Nazis insisted that American abundance was weakness, that comfort would rot the spirit. But many others quietly admitted what they saw with their own eyes. This was not weakness. This was power. For the first time, cracks appeared in the certainty that the Reich had fed them for years. If America could fight a war on 2 continents, feed its citizens, supply its allies, and still feed its enemies daily, what did that say about the world they thought they understood? Here lies the lesson. Abundance doesn't just nourish bodies, it reshapes beliefs. Every spoonful of stew, every steaming mug of coffee chipped away at the story they had once believed. And soon, those meals would lead them to an even deeper realization, not just about America's food, but about America's strength itself. 7. America's quiet weapon, feeding enemies with strength. As weeks turned into months, the true weight of America's abundance revealed itself. The prisoners began to see that food was more than sustenance, it was a statement. Every orderly meal, every clean barrack, every hot mug of coffee carried a quiet message. We are strong enough not only to defeat you, but to care for you. It was a kind of power the Germans had never imagined, not brutal, not shouted through propaganda, but steady and confident. The contrast was stark. Stories trickled into the camps about fellow soldiers who had fallen into Soviet hands. There, starvation was the rule, cruelty a weapon. Many never returned. Against that backdrop, America's approach seemed almost unbelievable. To be treated not with starvation, but with routine meals and humane conditions, it was a form of psychological warfare more effective than punishment. Some prisoners clung to ideology, declaring that German discipline would outlast American comfort. But others, quietly, began to admire what they experienced. For them, the mess hall became a classroom. The lesson was not spoken aloud, but it was clear. True strength is not proven by breaking your enemy, but by having the confidence to feed him. Years later, some of these men would return home and speak of what they had seen of steaming kitchens, orderly camps, and the strange fact that they ate better in captivity than their families did in Germany. A few never went back at all, choosing instead to build new lives in the very country they had once mocked. Here lies the lesson. Cruelty may win obedience, but kindness can win respect. And in that quiet respect, America wielded a weapon far stronger than propaganda could ever match. But perhaps the most lasting effect of all was not what happened in the camps, but what the prisoners carried home. Because those meals, simple as they were, left an impression that shaped how they, and later, their nation saw America. 8. The larger lesson: abundance as a measure of strength. In the end, what began as laughter ended in silence. The German soldiers who once mocked America's luxuries discovered something they could not have imagined. Abundance was not weakness, it was strength. They had expected cruelty, humiliation, and hunger. Instead, they found clean barracks, steady meals, and a strange kind of dignity. The irony was sharp. Many ate better behind barbed wire in America than their own families did back home. But within that irony lay a revelation. Propaganda had promised that luxury would break a nation. Reality proved the opposite. The United States was fighting a world war on 2 continents, supplying allies across oceans, feeding its own people, and still had the confidence to feed its enemies with bread, meat, and coffee. That was not indulgence, that was power. For some, the lesson lingered long after the war. Returning to Germany, they told hushed stories of mess halls where steaming kitchens never ran empty. Others carried a quieter respect for America into the years of reconciliation that followed. And a few chose never to leave, building new lives in the very land they had once ridiculed. Here lies the final lesson. True strength is not measured only in the weapons you wield, but in the abundance you can share. To starve an enemy is easy. To feed him takes confidence. And in that confidence, America revealed a deeper kind of victory, one that outlasted the battlefield. So when we look back at the story of German prisoners in America, it isn't just about rations or meals. It's about something larger, the quiet power of generosity, and the reminder that sometimes the strongest nations are not those who take away, but those who can give.